Hello everyone and welcome back again. In this session, we'll start looking on the process of concrete casting. How do we cast the concrete? In the previous section, we discussed the mixed proportion of the concrete, and we have seen that the concrete is made of cement, water, and aggregate. And aggregate, we have fine aggregate and we have coarse aggregate. So these are the main ingredients, the main material to produce the concrete. So these are the material that we require to make a concrete. And today we need to know how to mix the concrete or how concrete is being prepared, how to produce a concrete, the process, the steps of producing the concrete. We already know the material, we already have the material, but we need to know how to cast the concrete, how to prepare the concrete. So how do we cast the concrete? We have different steps or stages that we need to go through and in order to get the proper mixing or the proper casting of the concrete with the good quality of the concrete. So the first one is adding the right proportion of the concrete material, the cement, fine aggregate, coarse aggregate, and the water. So we have the mixed proportion. We know how much based on the concrete mix design. We know that we need to use this amount of kilogram of cement and this amount of sand, this amount of water, and this amount also of the coarse aggregate. We prepare, we weigh them, so we have this one in front of us. So we know how much, based on the mixed proportion, we all know the quantity of this aggregate, the quantity of the sand or the cement and the water in addition to the sand. So we know how much we need to mix. So we prepare the mixed proportion. Then we start mixing the concrete thoroughly, mixing the concrete thoroughly, then placing the concrete, then compacting the concrete, then curing the concrete. So these are in general, but in this session we start looking in more details and the purpose of each step and how each step will affect the quality of the concrete or will affect the concrete casting. But in general, we need to prepare the mixed proportion or the right proportion of the concrete material. Then we start mixing them, placing, compacting, and lastly we need to cure the concrete. So we have batching, then we mixing, then transporting or handling the concrete, then we start to place the concrete, compact the concrete, and lastly, we need to cure the concrete. We will go through each step here in more details and we will discuss the purpose of each one, the process, the techniques, the material, or the method, the technology that we need to use for each step. So starting with the first one, the first step, the concrete production step, starting with batching. What do we mean by batching? Here is the batching. So what is batching? Batching is actually the process of collecting, storing the proportioning of the concrete material before mixing. Material are proportioned according to the specification or according to the mix design. So before you go through the concrete casting, you need to do the concrete mix design based on calculation. And at the end of this calculation, you come out with how much cement, how much water, how much sand, and how much gravel you need to use, the mixed proportion, the ratios. So the first one is batching. Batching is preparing how much cement, how much aggregate, how much water, and how much gravel do we need. Measurement can be done in the form of the weight. And this is the most common techniques that we are using. Kilogram, how many kilogram do I need of cement, how many kilogram of sand, and how many kilogram of water, and the same goes for the coarse aggregate. So we are preparing the material in the form of the weight. We might also use a volume, consider the volume, but it's not actually applicable. And the volume, it can be used for the lab, the testing techniques that we're using, like small quantity of the mixing. But the most common that we are using in the weight by using how many kilogram of each material. So this is the first batching. So the first step is batching. Batching is measuring how much cement, how much water, how much aggregate, and the same goes for the coarse aggregate. We prepare this material. After we measure this material, then we go for the next step, The next step is the mixing, mixing the concrete ingredients. So the mixing operation consists essentially of rotating or steering. So the purpose of mixing, we'll start to know the purpose of mixing and the techniques of mixing. The mixing can be done in rotating or steering. So this is the techniques that how we are mixing the concrete ingredient or the concrete material in the rotation or steering. The purpose of the mixing, which is very much important here, and there is so many questions are coming for the purpose of concrete material mixing. So after we already weigh the material, measure the quantity, then we start mixing, right? And the mixing, it can go through rotating or steering or band type mixer, and the same goes for all of them. But what is the purpose of mixing the material together? It seems like okay, mixing, we need to mix the all the material together, but the science behind mixing, actually the science behind mixing process is to coat all the surface of the aggregate with the cement paste. So why do we need to mix the concrete? In order to coat all the aggregate particles, the fine aggregate, which is sand and the gravel, we need to coat the surface with the cement paste. Because we have discussed before that the purpose or what is the science of the concrete. The concrete actually is we're using cement paste as a binder material that is combine, bind, or act like a glue that you glue all the concrete or all the aggregate particles, they glue it together and come out with a big stone. We call it concrete. So in order to glue all the aggregate particle, so we need to distribute, we need to make sure that all the sand particles, all the coarse aggregate particle are covered by the glue. So what is the glue here? Is the cement paste. So the cement paste is act like a glue that is the glue all the particles of the aggregates. So what is the purpose of the mixing? In order to make sure that we are gluing, coat the surface of all the aggregate particle with cement paste. Why? Because the cement paste is act like a glue and we need to combine and bind all the material or the aggregate together. Mixing time actually depends on the quantity of the mix and the workability. So how much time do I need to mix the material or mix the concrete? Actually, it's based on the quantity of the or the volume of the mixtures. Avoid over mixing, and we must also clean the mixer after finishing, because the concrete is hardened over time and it will be much difficult to clean the mixtures in after long term. So these are different type of mixtures that different type of mixer that we normally use for this process of concrete mixing. The third one, so after we done with hand batching, mixing, then we go for transportation. So transportation or handling is the same. There are many methods of transporting the concrete from the mixer to the site. So one of the methods here, we have different methods here. We have bucket, we have dumper and monorail, crane, we have pumper, a chassis, conveyor, etc. So these are the techniques and the method that help us to transport the concrete from the mixer where we mix the concrete and we need to transport the concrete to the site, right? So these are some of the methods that we normally use in order to transport the concrete, starting with bucket and wheelbarrow. This one is actually being used in if we are casting a small quantity of the concrete, and the mixer should be close to the site where we casting, and we need also long distance can cause segregation. Like if the mixer is quite far from the sites and we are using this method, then we might have problem to the concrete, and the main common problem that could happen is segregation. We will have in more details about segregation later, segregation problem. We also might use crane and skip. This is the crane and skip that help us also to transport the concrete from the mixture to the site. to transport concrete in also in a vertical direction. It can also help in the vertical direction, can easily reach the work area, also used to transport reinforcing and formwork. This method also, it can be used as a crane. In addition to the transporting the concrete, it can also use as a crane to transport the other construction material. The other one here is the chance and conveyor. This one is the most common, also used to transport the concrete from the mixer to the site. And the most common here is the pumper, by pumping the concrete. For large volume discharge, it is fast. This method is fast, efficient, and less wastage. Deliver more than 30 cubic meter per hour, very fast. It can deliver up to 300 meter in horizontal direction, and it can go up to 100 meters in a vertical direction. So these are different methods to transport the concrete from the mixer to the site. This is the third step. The fourth step, after we transport the concrete to the site, then we start placing the concrete. This is what we mean by placing the concrete. So after mixing of concrete, it should be placed within 30 minutes of adding water. Why? Because when cement get in touch with water, then we start chemically react and start to harden over time. It start to gain strength over time. So we need to make sure that we can handle the concrete. The concrete is still watery, still wet, and we can easily transport, easy place, easy vibrate the concrete before the concrete start to gain some strength. It should be quickly transported to the place of flying by using iron fans manually. So these are the how we can transport the concrete. Concrete should not be dropped from a high distance. This is also an important, that concrete should not be dropped like the pump here is the cube should be close to the where do we cast. We shouldn't drop the concrete in a high distance, because dropping the concrete from a high distance, it will start to have problem to the concrete like segregation. So it would cause segregation of the concrete. Ensure that the formwork is clean, this form is green, paint inside form with the greases, oil, in order for the demold or removing the formwork, the concrete doesn't stick with the wood or the formwork. Ensure formwork is strong in order to avoid any collapsing due to the heavy of the concrete. Don't use the vibration to move concrete horizontally. Don't drop concrete higher than 1.5 meter in order to avoid segregation problem. And for large volume casting, we need to cast the concrete in different layers. Each layer is vibrated, compacting, then we go for the second layer, vibrate, compact, then we go for the last layer, vibrate and compact. We don't like cast the concrete. If we are casting huge volume of concrete, it is recommended to use it layer by layer. So this is placing the fourth step of concrete casting process.